Hey, I'm Shaye Wanner, and you are listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Whether you are a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Folks, today we are going to talk about consumer perceptions and buying patterns and how they impact our decisions as ranchers with Lamar Steiger. Lamar has experience both as a rancher and in the retail space, so I always really appreciate his perspective because it's unique and a valuable one to listen to. I think a lot of you are going to find this conversation interesting. It's a topic that I think as ranchers we need to be more aware of and dive into a little more. So I don't want to keep you waiting any longer because I'm really excited about this episode. And with that, I think it's time to visit with Lamar. Marketing your calves each year doesn't have to be a guessing game or settling for the easiest option. Join me this August for a 4-week online calf marketing short course that walks ranchers through what makes calves more valuable, what marketing options are available, and how they can manage risk best for their operation. Most importantly, ranchers will leave this series with a plan and newfound confidence to market their calves for their true value for years to come. Register by July 28th using the link in the show notes. Lamar, it is a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I know it's probably been, year, maybe 2 years since I had you on one of the Rancher Mind calls, and you are a wealth of knowledge there. I've listened to other podcasts you've been on, and I'm really excited that you're able to join me today.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be asked, and I always enjoy a conversation with you and look forward to this chat.
All right. Well, to help the listeners get to know you a little more, it's always the fun question for me, and maybe not for my guests because it's a heavy hitter, but why do you bet on the beef industry?
I love the question, and I am a big believer in the future of beef. I think that, number one, it's a nutrition thing that our American consumer needs, and I think we're gaining ground on the education of our consumers for that, but also, just like probably everyone else that's listening to your podcast every time you have one, it is a lifestyle like no other. And my wife and I have figured out how to make a living by being in the beef business, not only as ranchers, but also working with supply chains, with grocers. And so we're delighted that we can kind of invest our life in something that we consider is important. And it's part of our legacy, both on her side of the family and my side as well.
Well, I appreciate that honest response there. And so you mentioned that, your role in the beef industry is mixed. You have this ranching role, and then you have this role with supply chains. Can you outline that briefly for us so consumers get a little bit of an idea of how you are involved in the industry today?
Yeah, lifetime in the ranching business. My grandfather he was from Wisconsin and a rug maker, and he bought a ranch in the 30s in northeast Wyoming near the Devil's Tower. And then my dad took it over after World War II, and it was Horned Herefords, and he was an early innovator, and he was one of the very first to use artificial insemination, but also one of the very first breeders in the United States to use Simmental, Limousin, and experimented with that and ended up with Charolais by the late 60s, and he moved the herd down to northwest Arkansas. He had been in a bad farm accident in 66, and he said that it wasn't that winter was so bad on his knee, it was the length of winter that was hard on his knee. And so he and mom ended up buying a place near Bentonville, Arkansas, and we had dairy cows and Charolais cows, and eventually sold the ranch to my father-in-law, who was a Walmart executive. And Walmart, when we moved here, had 16 stores, and I think now they have, just in the United States of Walmart itself, not Sam's Club, like 4,600. And then eventually, jumping ahead, in 2014, I ran my father-in-law's Black Angus ranch, which was called Jack's Ranch. And we started in 83 and just dispersed. And my mother-in-law passed away about a year ago. And we just dispersed that herd in October of last year. But I quit running the ranch back in the late 1990s and worked at my church and some other things, but always kept my hands into the beef business. And so in 2014, the CEO of the Walmart US asked me to help them to improve he told me, quote, they had a much deserved bad reputation in beef. And I was a local rancher that he knew well. And so I was thrilled to get to be a consultant for Walmart and Sam's Club for 11 years. I just ended that relationship as an official consultant last January 1st. And I have lived in Bentonville for a long, long time, but I never really was behind the curtain of what retailers actually do and what they're doing. And the education that I got from the beef team, both at Sam's Club and Walmart, has just been an enormous help for me in my perspective of how me should be ranching and my family should be ranching and what we should be thinking about.
That is very interesting. I think just that you as an individual get to be so hands-on on very opposite ends of the industry. So we're going to talk about kind of consumer perception and buying behaviors today for beef. Simply because from my perspective as a rancher, I think it's really important for us to know what matters to the person who buys the product and kind of what's going on in their minds or lives that's influencing those buying decisions. Because if we don't have someone to buy it, where's our business model? So why do consumers go back to beef as a protein source?
Yeah, isn't it amazing? I mean, our consumption per pound, not just in dollars, but the consumption in weight that consumers are eating is a really growing number. And so I think May of 2024 to that month, and then if you compare it to May of 2025, the American consumers ate 1% more in weight. And so, there's been an attack on cattle from all kinds of different fronts in our society, and there's been an attack on eating meat as a protein, and I think we've survived it. I think that maybe we didn't respond well to start with, but I think consumers have kind of figured it out maybe on their own. One of the things that's happened since really COVID started is that there's really been a movement back among young men grilling, and they also are really into working out. And a percentage of young men that hasn't been that way in a long, long time. And they're learning and they're reading a lot and they're investigating. And so they're not only grilling more meat, they're eating more meat. And so, as you might remember, during COVID, we all had to stay at home, and men went out and bought grills. I just will take my son-in-law as an example. I'm really pretty good on anecdotal evidence, but I really like that. But he, I think he ended up buying 3 grills over the course of COVID, and really, really has gotten into cooking, and he's still doing that, even though now restaurants have been open for several years, and we could have gone right back to the way we were. So consumers are very interested in health, and we have a great product. We have been short, as I said, in really telling the consumers what a great product we all have, but they're figuring it out, and I think our consumption could go even higher as our quality of cattle gets better, and that beef is still something that people go back to. And, we just finished with July 4th holiday, and the amount of meat that was sold over the holiday in the United States is astounding. And it's what people really want to go back to. And so we need to make sure that we treat those consumers well, and that every animal that we raise, and this is something I talk to my crew a lot about, every animal we raise needs to have its best day every day, so that the quality of that product, when it eventually gets to somebody's grill, is so good that it makes them happy and it's not a disappointment to them. And we're getting better and better, and I'm excited. I'm more excited about the future of beef now than I ever have been.
I really appreciate everything you said there. I think it's been really fun and interesting to watch people get into grilling and cooking at home. And even, I myself in the women's health space, there's a big push for more animal products there too. And that's really reassuring to see. Even if sometimes there is still some misinformation in there, the overarching picture is that people and health professionals are pushing others to eat meat. And I think that's really reassuring. Now, my follow-up question to that would be, when these consumers are out purchasing beef. You talked about the health aspect of it, and the grilling aspect touches on the social side. But what really matters to them when they're at that meat case and deciding what they're going to buy today?
One thing I love working with Walmart is Walmart keeps things pretty simple. They really keep things simple, and their whole thing is to help people save money so they can live better. And so one of the very first things that I learned from working with them is meat on the shelf is the most important item. And so you don't even think about that. But our supply chains have been so broken, and they were especially broken during COVID, but that if you don't have all the product on the shelf every time the consumer goes in, then that is really frustrating to the consumer, and they'll go find a new grocery store. The next thing they have to have is they want a good, very good product at a good value. And no matter what we think about beyond that with attributes, those are the three things on the shelf, a very good product at a good value. And so one of the things that's been really interesting is watching the price of retail beef has had to go up. And these folks in Bentonville, both at Sam's Club and Walmart, they do everything they can to find ways not to have to raise prices. And it is one of the most painful things that those folks ever do. It doesn't matter whether you're selling spray paint or if you're selling vegetables or if you're selling clothes or meat or whatever. When they have to raise prices, it is a bad day. And they have so many dollars of cost to do it. So sometimes they have to. And as you know, with the price of cattle and the price of our entire supply chain of production for cattle being so high right now, they've had to raise prices. And so those are the three things that matter the most to the consumer.
So what do you think makes it a good product to the consumer? When it's steak, do consumers understand the marbling aspect of it? I mean, what makes it good to them outside of, having a good price?
So customers may not really understand the marbling. Some of them may not really understand the different grades. But when they get a steak they're disappointed in, they really understand that. And so one of the great results, and I think this is really a key part in the continued demand for beef, is the great result in our improvement in our genetics. And I think once we introduced the DNA testing, and then when the cow numbers got low in the late 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10 in there, and then when we rebuilt the herd, we not only rebuilt the herd with better cattle that had better genetics, but the bulls that we bought were also a lot better than they had been 10, 12 years before. And so the number of choice carcasses, the number of upper two-thirds choice and prime carcasses, as you know, just has continued to go up. And so we're able to put a product in front of consumers that's better than it's ever been. But if we're not relentless of that, and I would want to challenge every rancher to be thinking about, we're not just selling pounds. We have to be thinking about selling something that the consumer would love to put on their plate. And so that is just such an important part of satisfying the consumer. And so, I'll just use Walmart as an example, and I get to talk to a lot of retailers now that I don't just consult for Walmart, but I'll use them as an example, as they have a black tray, which is upper two-thirds choice, Angus sire, not just black hide, but it's virtually the same specs as CAB, only they actually require that the supply chain signs off and has an affidavit that it is Angus sired. And then they have enough prime coming through that they have some prime in a blue package. Now, the value proposition at Walmart is a white package, which is low choice, and I'm sure there's select in there too, although the number of select carcasses is getting lower and lower as this quality thing really hits hard. And so Walmart would have 3 price points on almost everything they sell, and that'd be good, better, best. And so being able to offer that Blue Jay Prime is an exciting addition for them, and they're thrilled with what the American cattle producer has done to put that in front of them. And so I think their customers have kind of trained themselves by which color tray they buy, and the black tray is by far the highest selling, and the one that, as you know, if it's CAB specs Angus sired, it's going to, for the most part, it should be a really good good eating experience.
Hey folks, have I told you about my all-time favorite seasoning? It's called Pluck. Whether I am grilling steaks, making spaghetti, or wanting to add more flavor to veggies, I reach for Pluck. Pluck is not just a regular seasoning mix. It contains beef organs for added flavor and nutrients. It's tasty and a fun way to add more meat to your meals. You can learn more at eatpluck.com and get a 15% discount by using the code Shaye Wanner. That code is spelled SHAYEWANNER, and I will include the link and the code in the show notes. Now, I know you brought up briefly kind of the rancher side of it with bull selection and DNA tests, and I want to go back to that. But while we're still talking about the consumer, I'm really curious about your perspective and what you see on the traceability front, because I think that's something that we've been told for a lot of years now. Traceability matters to the consumer. They want to know where their product's coming. And you talked about COVID, and there was a big move towards direct to consumer there, partially because of the supply chains, but also then people wanted to know where it was coming from. So is that something that truly matters to the consumer? But also, what is traceability to the consumer? To what extent is traceability, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so it's a big country with over 200 million people. 200, I can't remember, but it's a lot of people. And so there are consumers on all parts of the spectrum. I heard a grocer say a couple years ago that every consumer wants to know that the grocer knows where this food came from and they can trust their grocer. And that would be the almost every consumer out there, is they have to put their trust into their grocer, and they hope that their grocer knows about that supply chain, and they would trust that their grocer could back up the claims that they make. But because we have such a hard time on supply chains at scale, like big supply chains, and I'm 100% for all the amazing farm to table and smaller supply chains that are going on all across the country, and I hope that each one of them are successful. And it's pretty easy when it's a few hundred head to make sure that you track and trace, and that you know everything about those animals, and oftentimes all of them come off of one farm. And so there are a percentage of consumers, and some of the numbers I've heard have varied, but what I've kind of come to after having a lot of conversation with a lot of grocers is that 90%, 85, 90% of the American consumers want to know that their grocer knows where the food comes from. And so that leaves, 15% or 10%, somewhere in there, that want to know more. And so those are the ones that want to know exactly where they came from, and they want the grocer to be able to verify where these animals came from. 5% or maybe less are really, really interested in a lot of attributes. And so attributes might be no hormone added, NHTC. The attributes might be organic. The attributes, you can name off any number of attributes. And those are attributes that you can really stand behind when you have tracing and tracking of those animals. And so one of the things that I've really been talking about a lot when I have the opportunity to go and speak, whether it's on a podcast or give a speech, is that so much of our population of producers that don't want any tracing and any tracking of our animals are also the ones that are very frustrated when they hear that there's foreign meat being imported and that there's foreign meat coming in. They want an American supply chain, but they don't want to track their animals. They don't want anybody to have any kind of tracking on that. And the two are so diametrically opposed because the grocer would love to make the claim that it's 100% American beef, but their lawyers won't let them make the claim unless they can verify that through EID tags and through some sort of a tracking of that animal, because the last thing they want to do is get sued when something happens that they make a claim and that claim is not true. And the grocers don't want to do that. They don't want to make false claims. But it really has hindered the ability of large supply chains not the farm to table, direct to consumer that you mentioned, but for large supply chains have really been hindered by the fact that it's really difficult to get large number of animals that have any kind of traceability on them.
That is really interesting, and I've seen that too in visiting with producers, that there is quite an opposition there for things that could be working together, which is frustrating.
Yeah, you're exactly right.
Is there anything else you want to share on the consumer buying front before we kind of switch perspectives and talk about ranchers?
Just to wrap that up, it's consumers are demanding a high quality product. Grocers know this is really interesting. We hadn't talked about this, but it's really consumer driven. Is grocers know that when somebody buys beef in their grocery store, they also will buy a lot more items. And beef is not a big money maker for grocery stores. Many people think that the grocers are making a huge margin on beef, but not some grocers do. And some grocers, they're not going for the kind of price point that the two retailers here in Bentonville, Arkansas go for. Is an everyday low price, but some grocers do. But most grocers that I talk to have a very low margin on beef. And what they're doing is they know that when you go into the grocery store and you put beef in your basket, you also buy multiple other items that you wouldn't buy if you didn't buy beef there. And that might be ketchup for hamburgers, it might be buns, it might whatever it is. And some of those items, a lot of those items have a lot better, margin than beef does. And so they know that they have to win in beef. And I think that's one of the things that I've come to the conclusion about in the beef industry is that grocers want our product on their shelves and they want a high quality product on their shelves. It's not like some items that they don't really want on the shelf, but the beef that people buy fills the basket. The grocers know that when somebody buys beef, that they also buy more items. And so to me, that's just a real exciting reflection of the consumer and also how important beef is to our grocery stores.
Well, Lamar, as we kind of switch gears and move towards talking about the rancher and how this conversation impacts them, I think a place to start is several times in the last 15-20 minutes, you've brought up that consumers want a good product. And so when ranchers are making genetic selections, whether it's for replacement females, bulls, what have you, what can they keep in mind so that they can deliver a product that the consumer will enjoy and the consumer will want to come back to beef again?
Yeah, sometimes I think that we forget that the end product here is something that everybody can eat. And so I'm all for having a balanced genetic package because we also know that our cow herd is the most important part. It's the factory. And if a cow does not get pregnant, it's like owning a factory for an entire year or however long she's open and owning her and she doesn't produce any goods. And so every single cow out there is a factory. And so we have to have great maternal traits, obviously. But I do think that we as an entire industry can focus on both. I really think that we can focus on both. And I think one of the things that seems to be happening a bit is some herds and some genetic progressive breeders that have impact and influence are focusing on one or the other, either carcass or maternal. And I think like many other industries, there's nothing wrong with going and get your replacements or your bulls for the replacements from one breeder and going and get your bulls for carcass quality at another if you're going to concentrate heavily in one or the other, because using bulls that are very high carcass traits may not be the replacement females you want. And so I think that the information that we have at our hands from the associations, and I'm an Angus breeder, and so I'll speak to the Angus Association, but the amount of data and information that they're giving us back from our reporting is astounding. I don't think many people outside of our industry have the slightest idea of just how sophisticated we are or we can be with making our genetic selections. And so as for me and my herd, what I've done is, so as my family's business as my mother-in-law got older, and that was obviously something that was going to change. We bought our own ranch in 2020, and we call it the 808 Ranch, and we have 3 locations now, 2 in Arkansas and 1 in Missouri, where it's based in Missouri. And what we've done in order to ramp up our production is we have gone into the bull raising business for the Walmart supply chain. When Walmart put together their first supply chain, they partnered with a ranch in Texas called 44 Farms. The owner of 44 owns a company called Prime Pursuits. And Prime Pursuits procures animals for the first supply chain that Walmart did that serves 500 or 600 stores in Florida and Georgia. So 44 needs bulls. And so what we've done is that the first we bought embryos from them, and now we raise our own embryos. And we raise bulls that are born in October, sex semen, and sexing the embryos. And we raise bulls that are born in August and September. And then we have them all winter, and we take care of them. And then we send all of those ET bulls down to Texas in April. And they raise them through the summer, and then they put them in their October bull sale. And and we're kind of under the umbrella of 44. And I think as a sideline comment is I think there's going to be more and more of us that are going to cooperate with each other under the umbrella of one of the larger breeders. And because the larger breeder can just maybe offer so much more to big bull buyers or even smaller bull buyers than individuals can, smaller ranches like mine. And so I'm very pleased to be kind of under the umbrella of 44 and raising bulls that work for them. They sell them in their bull sale, and then the Prime Pursuits company tries to buy those bulls back, if they can, for the Walmart supply chain. And so it thrills me to death that some of the bulls that I raise are producing the calves that are on the Walmart counter and this shelf and in the freezer, or the refrigerated case, I guess, and that American consumers, that I know where my beef is going, and that's to the Walmart consumer.
I always think that's a really cool and interesting story that Walmart and 44 Farms and Prime Pursuits has going on there, and one that a lot of producers have benefited from. But the bigger picture of that, which has been talked about on the show before and on my Rancher Mind calls before, is just that supply chain collaboration in general and how producers across the country are benefiting from it, like you said, because maybe there's more relationships that can be built there, more negotiating power, and just overall opportunity for where our calves go.
Yeah, I think the future is going to be, and I'm just one guy here in Arkansas, but I have some experience. I think the future is going to be more and more coordinated supply chains. I actually formed a company with a friend of mine in Northwest Arkansas. We call it Ranch to Retail, and it's ranch with the number 2 retail.com if anybody wants to look at it. But what we've thought about and what we're looking at is that there's a lot of grocers that don't have the size and power of a Walmart or a Sam's Club. And there's a lot of grocers that are looking for ways to make sure that they have the tracing and trackability that we talked about earlier, that they want to meet the customer's demand for better and more beef that they can make claims about, that there's a fair number of consumers that want those claims met. And so we formed this company, and my team is mostly made up of consumer product people. So one of the interesting things here in Northwest Arkansas is that there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of consumer product companies, whether it's Procter & Gamble or whether it's some really small company that sells olives to Walmart from Italy or whatever. They're all based here in Bentonville, and we have this expertise in analytics and in supply chains because seemingly to me, every other supply chain in the world has been reinvented and improved except for beef. And I think we're the last great frontier as far as organized supply chains. And I'm excited about that because it'll just more and more make sure that the consumer gets exactly what they want. And part of that's a consistently good product at a good price. And so these guys have taken a fresh look at the beef business, and we're a startup company, and we're just so excited about the future as we engage with grocers about the possibilities of more supply chains.
So, Lamar, I know this wasn't necessarily on the question list that we talked about when we outlined the podcast interview, but I'm just really curious with your perspective, both as a rancher and being involved in kind of the supply chain and retail side. When you got involved in that retail side, what perspective shifted for you as a rancher about how you were operating? I mean, we've talked about, raising a good product for consumers already, but what else shifted for you as you began to get more involved on the other end of the beef industry?
Well, I think the first thing that was a surprise to me, and I've just had a conversation recently with a Walmart executive who's a rancher they've hired to help with their procurement of their cattle. And he said the same thing, is that he thought the grocery stores made a big margin on beef. And it was just like shocking to me back in 2014, 15, and 16 when, they didn't lay it out to me and say, hey, Lamar, here's our pitiful margins in beef. But after a while, you kind of pick up on the fact that there's really not a big margin in beef for them. And like I talked about earlier, they have to have it because it's something that fills the basket. And as long as consumers want it, they're going to have it, So, and I think the other thing is that being that our industry is so fragmented, and that even within one breed, the different ideas and the different perspectives that every rancher has on what they consider the best and their quality. And I do think that for their region and for what they have to do to raise cattle, like you're in North Dakota, you have to have a certain type of cattle and all that survive in that kind of environment. And people in Florida have to have a certain kind of cattle and all in that. But I think that our vision is pretty low as producers. I think we're keeping our vision pretty low. And I just discovered that consistency of value and quality is so much more important that I think that our industry has talked about until Walmart kind of did what they did, was the shocking thing that they did with prime pursuits to our industry is that we need to think just beyond our marketing, whether it's the local sale barn or whether it's Superior or however you market your cattle to the neighbor, whatever it is I would challenge producers to think about, what is the end goal? Where are those cattle going to end up? And not just be glad to have a check on the day that you market them, but to be more involved in that supply chain. And I think that what I've seen here in Bentonville with all the other supply chains, and how the more efficient they get, the more streamlined they get, the more money they make, whether it's in streamlining, Ollie's, like I mentioned, or Procter & Gamble or whatever, and fruits and vegetables and other proteins as well are a lot more organized than our beef business is. And they don't lose, the producers don't lose out. The producers actually do better when they're part of something bigger than themselves.
I appreciate you sharing your perspective there. Lamar, is there anything else that you feel is really important to bring up to the ranchers listening today about this topic before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think what I would want to bring up is that what you're doing and what others are doing with podcasts and with social media is just so important. And I would really challenge every rancher to make sure that they have a voice on social media. And you just never know if you're the one that's going to catch on. And you're the one that housewives in Atlanta and housewives in Phoenix and meat buyers in Denver, you just don't know if you're going to be the one that is the one that catches on, that can help change the industry. And it really, isn't it exciting that it flattens out? We don't have to hire a Madison Avenue advertising firm. It's somebody putting video out or a podcast out about just how ranching works that catches on and catches the American consumer. And so, but in that regard, I would just really suggest that you really be careful about what you put out there. For instance, consumers in Atlanta, Georgia, and Philadelphia don't want to see you firebrand a calf. And I mean, dragging a calf with a rope is something that's just part of our culture, and firebranding is required in many Western states and all, but I just don't think that that's helpful when we put that out on social media. And so really get involved. I'm 63 years old, so I'm pretty slow to the party of how things change. But our world has changed. And you can really improve the sale of meat, beef for the country with a really interesting social media presence. And some of us don't want to do it at all. And I have a wonderful daughter, Emily, who runs our social media for both the Ranch to Retail and also for the ranch and our family. And she's really brought me along, and I've really realized that the importance of influencers.
Well, thank you for that. And Lamar, to wrap up, my final question for you, which is a more personal one, is if you could go back to your first 5 years in the beef industry, what would you do differently, if anything?
Yeah, so as an adult, my first 5 years was in 1983. My dad got really, really ill, and he was paralyzed for a while with a weird thing called Guillain-Barré, and interest rates were terrible, and we had a drought here in Northwest Arkansas, and my father-in-law ended up buying our ranch from us, which was awesome. And my dad ended up being able to sell it and not go to bankruptcy or anything like that. And my father-in-law, Jack Shoemaker, who was a Walmart executive, he bought it, and then he asked me to be the manager. And I was really young, really, really young. And what we did during the 80s was we chased the fad. And so at that time, the experts, these university professors, and I don't know who all those experts were back then, but the experts were like, we need to get these cattle taller and taller and taller. And, we didn't ruin the Angus breed, but we sure abused the Angus breed during the 80s with getting taller animals, and other breeds did it as well. And so what I would go back to is I wish that I had really kept in mind what my dad had taught me, instead of getting excited about the fad and when at that time, the show ring was really important. And so my dad, one of his favorite sayings was steady. It's a kind of a takeoff on a biblical proverb. I think in chapter 5 of Proverbs is steady plodding makes for great gain. And so, we're really excited about all the data and all the information that we have from genetics and phenotype on our ranch, and I just want to be really careful. And so that's probably the lesson that I wish I had remembered from my childhood.
All right. Well, Lamar, I always appreciate our conversations and your honesty within them and perspective. So thank you again for being on the show today. Folks, if you are interested in any resources or businesses that were mentioned today throughout our conversation, or even as an ad, I will be sure to put those links in the show notes as always. So be sure to check out that description before you click onto your next podcast so that you can access those resources and get the most value out of this podcast. Remember, the best way to support this podcast and all your other favorite podcasts is to leave a rating or review, and better yet, share it with a friend who will find this content valuable. But with that, happy ranching, folks.